The schooner racing originally started in 1920 between Gloucester, Massachusetts and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, hence the Bluenose, which is tied over there today. She challenged the Gloucester fishermen to a schooner race. Not the Bluenose, but the town of Lunenburg, financed by the Halifax Herald and some real big businessmen. And Gloucester sent a boat up there called the Esperanto, Captain Marty Welch, and they beat the Haligonia out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. So when we won, Lunenburg got mad and decided to build a brand new schooner for the schooner races, hence the Bluenose. That's how she came about. And any fishing vessel that wanted to race had to fish the banks for at least a year before they could compete. So then, when World War II came, schooner races stopped. In 1952, a lot of the fishermen from Gloucester's fishing fleet and Lunenburg's fishing fleet decided to get it going again, but there was no more schooners. So they started doing it with dories, hence the dory races here in Gloucester and again in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And from then, the schooner race really took off, the Gloucester Schooner Festival as we call it today. I think this year was the year we had more small and big vessels in Gloucester Harbor. And you see that other fancy schooner over there called the Columbia. She once sailed against the original Bluenose, and the fellow who built her was originally fished out of Gloucester, and he decided to revitalize that part of it again. And now I think there's probably like 50 members on the Gloucester Schooner Fest committee, and it seems to get better every year. Any more questions?
I think you covered most of it.
I covered most of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much more I can tell you about it, but it's a good time, and a lot of friendships are made between all these schooner people. I mean, some of these schooners come from Maryland, New Jersey, Cape Cod, and from Nova Scotia, Maine. We've had some even come up from Bermuda a couple years ago. So it's pretty popular now.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nikki, and today I'm a Sea Scout. We're here on the Roseway with Tim.
Hi.
And we're waiting to board the Lynx so we can go on a little sail.
The Roseway is an original Grand Bank schooner. She's 93 years old. It was actually built right down the road in Essex, Massachusetts. So she fished in the Grand Banks for swordfish, along with her sister ship, the Adventure, which was built a year after the Roseway. And we're back here together in Gloucester, which is really cool. But for the past 15 or so years, we've been a sailing school vessel with World Ocean School. Before that, she was also a windjammer, so it's kind of like a bed and breakfast hotel on the seas, so people could come on board. That was in the 70s and 80s. Before that, she was a pilot vessel in Boston. She was actually the last sail-powered pilot vessel in the United States, which is pretty cool. So she's a National Historic Landmark for that reason, mainly. Those are just hatches. Below those areas is where we sleep. So there's a forward compartment called the forecastle. It's short for forecastle. There's 12 bunks in there, mainly for crew. Deckhands and the cook sleep down there. And through those doors behind us is the fish hold. It's where when we were a fishing vessel, we would store up to 1,000-pound swordfish down there. Really big space, but now we have 22 bunks for students. When they come on board, they sleep down there. Really tight spaces.
1812 and launched in Fells Point, Maryland, and she was captured on the Rappahannock River in 1813. She was then taken by the British to Halifax, where they put the crew in prison, and then they sailed her on to England, where they actually took her apart and drew her out. They looked at Lynx as the finest example of an American privateer, but they wanted to understand the technology of why these boats sailed so well, so fast, and were so maneuverable. The original plans, when the group got together to build this ship, the original plans that the British drew out in 1813 were found, and we used those to help draw out this deck. I didn't, the group did, to use to design this deck. We're thankful for the British because the Americans never put anything on paper. And if the British had not drawn out 3 ships, Lynx, Sultana, and there's another one that name escapes me. Those 3 ships have allowed us to enjoy most of what they were doing in 1812 era because none of it was ever put on paper. They didn't want to capture it, they didn't want to destroy. So that's the Lynx lineage. And I know we're just about to get underway. So what we're going to do is, a little thing different. We're going to go up into the harbor, set up there, and then go out. You get a chance to see the foretopsail in action. We'll fire a gun, we'll do a little history talk, we'll introduce the crew. So until then, just enjoy yourselves on starboard until we get off, and once we clear everything, then the ship will be available. Also, there's a lot of hauling to do, so the crew will ask for your help in hauling. And none of it's heavy as long as there are a few hands. It's all too heavy if there aren't enough hands. So thanks for that, and enjoy your sail with us.
Are they going to fire the cannons?
Take 4.
Take 2, take 4.
Big one.
That was skill right there.
Victory. There you go. Fenders up. Fenders up.
Where we start setting sail and looking like the fabulous schooner we are. So we need all of your help to help set our sails. We're going to try and do something spectacular today and set both our main and our headsails at the same time. So that needs lots of participation. So for anyone who wants to help out on the main, I'll have you line up right behind the guns on either side of the deck there in a single file line, and then I'll need a few people from forward to help me out with the headsails. I'll watch the children.
Ready on the throat, then E, ready on the throat. Both hands on the line, you got your pockets, ready to pull. Next you got it in here, haul away. Push haul me. Pull, and pull with your hands and your feet. Then with your hands. Don't walk backwards anymore, guys. Stay right where you are. Walk backwards, you're gonna run out of bones. Let the feet, over your whole way, pull together, hands over hands. Very important to put this together. So make sure you're looking up at me. That's my feet. I pull down. I got faith in you guys.
Easy peak. Feet down here, a little slower.
Go, guys, halfway there.
Hold the peak. Pencil team, right in the foretopsail. That's all throat. Hold it peak. Hold it peak.
Okay, walk the line to me.
What's on, guys?
And ensign up.
And open up.
We're on. You get the ensign
Let go of the line.
Got the line, guys.
Thank
Good
you.
job.
That's little peak. Ease headsails. Foretopsail. Stand by the set, foretopsail. On the foretopsail, cast off gear, sheet up. Go! Look out, Megan! On the Barbara! We're firing a gun! Cover your ears!
Sure, yep. That's,
Fire! Here, God.
I'm trained.
Fire!
Hey, there you go.
All right, guys, ready? Step your lines. Turns. Fast.
Is from Brooklyn, New York, and we have Richard. Richard is our local guy. We have him aboard to tell us where the rocks are in Gloucester Harbor, and he so eloquently said there's one right there. So that's Richard is from Gloucester, and we have Casey McKenzie back aft. Casey's the chief mate. Casey's from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then we have Captain Alex Peacock. Alex is from New Hampshire, and I'm Don Peacock from New Hampshire. And Alex actually lives more in Lynx than he does in New Hampshire. So Lynx's home port is Nantucket, and our winter port is St. Petersburg, Florida. Last winter, for example, we were in St. Pete, but we also voyaged to Galveston, Texas, Pensacola, Florida, and New Orleans. Lynx was built in 2001, launched in 2001, and it was built from 1999 to 2001 in Rockport, Maine. She spent her first 9 years on the West Coast and has been to Hawaii 3 times, as far north as Vancouver, as far south as through the Panama Canal twice. Lynx is modeled after a War of 1812 Baltimore Clipper, and she is all wooden. There is really nothing ornamental on deck. Everything functions as part of the ship's sailing. When we voyage with 13 or 11 to 13, and when we do regular sailings, we're down to as few as 6. We have a professional cook that stays with us, and the cook's duties are to cook and keep the crew healthy, and they do not have a deck position other than in an emergency. Lynx is a Coast Guard inspected vessel, which adheres to a much higher standard than just a regular vessel. We do about 30 Coast Guard inspections a year, and that's due to the amount of geography that we travel in. For example, yesterday, before we could do any people on deck, we were Coast Guard inspected. This summer we were in Boothbay, Maine, and Gloucester and Nantucket for the most part, and then we do education programs. do education programs in every port that we go into. So we get a little breeze coming up. We'll have a nice sail. We'll do a little history outside. These guns, we actually have 4 of them. We have 2 stowed below, but these guns were cast for the ship. These guns are period correct. They are not cannons. They're called carronades. And this would be the equivalent of like a sawed-off shotgun for home defense in the world of fighting. These are very close proximity, very powerful firing guns, but they were not the weight or the lack of the weight and the lack of elevation and articulation that long guns were. So most USS Constitution carries 25, 30-pound carronades. So even they have a lot of carronades on board. These are 6-pound carronades.
Okay, so we're here in the Lynx. We're going out of Boston Harbor. And what's your name?
Hi, I'm Kathy Heck.
Okay, so Kathy is on the Lynx with us. So where are you from? What brings you to Gloucester?
We are from Philadelphia area, about 45 minutes north of the city, in a town called near Doylestown, which is Bucks County. And we love Schooner Fest. We've been coming every year for probably the past 15 to 20 years.
So what do you do for work in Philadelphia?
So I own a tea room called the Talking Teacup that I've owned for about 15 years. And actually November will be our 15-year anniversary. And I heard you love baking and cooking, so we make scones and desserts, homemade soups, tea sandwiches, probably about 15 to 20 different kinds of scones.
I don't make scones.
You don't make scones?
Yeah. I'm more in the cakes, cupcakes,
Yep.
cookies.
We make a lot of desserts as well. We actually, from the day we opened and every day since, we have what we call our signature cookie, and it's just a sugar cookie that we make with different types of flavoring, and the flavoring that we use is the teas that we serve in the tea room. And every dessert that is plated and goes out has a teapot-shaped sugar cookie infused with tea. Yeah. So we like baking as well.
Yes. I can have you as a guest sometime.
Yes, there we go.
Drive all the way out here.
Drive all, yeah. Oh, we could bring scones and cookies to you,
Yes.
right? We love the area. We'll be back next year.
So, did you know you wanted to own a bakery type thing when you were growing up, or?
I absolutely love cooking, so I'm self-taught, but basically the chef at the tea room. And it's just a love I grew up with from my grandparents. They were both really good cooks. Irish and Italian, so I have the Irish side, and my grandma on the Irish side loved to bake. My grandma on my mom's side is Italian, so I learned all the cooking and making pasta and all that fun stuff as well. So I've never knew I wanted a tea room, but I've always been a tea drinker, and I always wanted some type of cooking, and I love being around the public and just the camaraderie of sharing tea with folks. So I said, okay, what do I want to be when I grow up? And decided to open a tea room. We actually use loose tea at the tea room. We have about 100 different flavors of tea, so we cover everybody's taste. But we also have a gift shop, and we actually, Tea Forte is the company of those triangle teas, and we sell them and many, many different kinds of tea.
They're all so cute.
They are very cute, and they have a little plate that they sit on, just the perfect size for them. Yeah.
So if you come to Schooner Fest every year, like you said earlier, how many different ships have you been on?
I would say probably about 10. Last year when we came up, we actually crewed on one of the ships for the race, which was really cool. But every year we come to the tours, we go on the different ships. We've been on Adventure and Lynx and Adele. So we try to visit the different ones each time we come.
To go on next year?
I'd love to crew on a ship again next year. So not sure which one, but that was really a lot of fun to be part of the action of the race day.
I mean, I don't know if you can catch it last minute. I know that the race is tomorrow.
I know. Unfortunately, we go home tomorrow, so we won't have time to stay for the race.
So they came up with these configurations of 4.5 pulling sails. these sails allow ships to go upwind, and this is nothing that the English had. They didn't understand it. So the original Lynx was captured in 1813, and she was sailed to Halifax, where the crew was put in prison, and then from there, Lynx was sailed to England, where the English took her part and drew out, and then they understood it. By that time, it was getting a little bit too late for the War of 1812. But the War of 1812 is significant because we had actually won our independence in the Revolutionary War. And here it is 38 years later, and we're still not a sovereign country. England never recognized the United States. They were trying to recognize individual states. England wanted our states to be at war with each other. They never wanted America to be a collective agreement United States. So they kept harassing us, and they put our country under what they call blockade. The blockade was our East Coast ports, Boston, New York, the Chesapeake. And what they would do is they would take a ship of the line and they would anchor these ships in the harbors, and those ships with their long guns would own the horizon. And these boats were still maintaining commerce with France. These boats were very good and swift of sailing, so they were nicknamed blockade runners, meaning they would take the worst weather, the darkest nights, the stormiest days, the foggiest days, and they would sail underneath the blockade and run to Bordeaux, France, where they would trade. Now in Bordeaux, one of two things would happen. They would reload with French goods, and they would run the blockade back into America with the goods up into the harbors, up into the towns, to sell the goods to the Americans. Or you would take your ship, your blockade runner, like Lynx, and you would outfit it in Bordeaux as a privateer. Now, privateer is a term for the private merchant navy. When President Madison declared war on England in 1812, he had 17 ships. He declared war against the mightiest navy in the world of 750. Madison needed some help. So what he did is he allowed private merchant ship owners to engage in privateering. They're going to use the English economy against the English might. What they did is they were selling, the government was issuing letters of marque and reprisal. You can see Lynx's original letter of marque and reprisal. It's a copy of it is down below. This letter of marque and reprisal set the course for private merchants to engage the British merchant fleet on any high sea in the world as a protected U.S. flagged vessel. These letters of marque for the original owners of Lynx, after they built the ship, the letter of marque cost them $34,000 in 1812 dollars. This letter of marque would be used as they would engage the British fleet. What they would do is if they rigged up as a privateer, they would go right into the English Channel and they'd start raiding in the English Channel. They're taking British commerce right in the English Channel. They would take their letter of marque and the cargo, they'd go into France and they'd adjudicate it in an Admiralty Court of Law and be awarded the money. Now that they've spent the $34,000 on their letter of marque, the goods that they sell, the ships were allowed to keep 90% of the dollars. And the dollars would go to the ship owners, to the captain, to the mate, to the deckhands, all the way down to the powder monkeys. They trickled this money throughout. It was very smart because these voyages were short and they were very profitable. Unlike whaling. Whaling voyages were very long, and if you're awash ashore in Nantucket and you've gone whaling, you come back after a 3 to 5 year voyage and you cannot even pay back the ship's store for the clothes you bought 3 years ago. So now they got you for the next voyage. Privateering was looked at as a way for parents to rent their kids out and make money. You have to know that America was primarily an agricultural land. They were trying to feed the families. If the British fed you the night before, you might be sympathetic to the British cause. But if you're a true patriot in Boston, in Concord, Lexington. If you're a patriot and you're bent on your independence, you're gonna be fighting for the American cause. So parents would rent their young kids out to privateers to make the only money that the house might bring in. So these boats would go up in the English Channel and they would raid. There's one boat that was responsible for $4.5 million of British commerce off the high seas. And this ship is called the Princeton Neuchtel. The Châtel was about a third larger than Lynx, and she was manned by 170 men and boys. A lot of privateers were captained by young Navy lieutenants because it was the only command that they would get. The Navy lieutenants would get a privateer and they'd outfit him with young men and boys. Once you're in France and you've outfitted your ship with the guns, the munitions, and the extra crew that you need to privateer, you go into the English Channel, you raid as much as you can, you take the cargo. You go into France, you sell it. But once the heat gets on in England, when the frigates start coming out. Now, a frigate is the same size as USS Constitution. Constitution, there were 6 ships of the same design. They took the best designs of the French and they took the best designs of the English ships. They combined all the good technology and built our frigates, Constitution and on. This morning when you woke up, Constitution in our active naval commission fleet today is the only naval vessel that put an enemy combatant on the bottom today. That could change tonight. The decommissioned vessels of World War II and everything, they're all decommissioned. Constitution is still commissioned. In the War of 1812, Constitution sailed with 3 Nantucket whaleboats on her deck. Nobody was ever killed while they were serving on the USS Constitution. She was literally called Old Ironsides because they did see the balls bouncing off of the hull of the live oak that she was made out of. She was an incredibly strong and robust vessel. It was said by the British Royal Navy that Constitution, because she started winning so many sea battles, that Constitution does not get engaged with but a minimum of 2 British frigates. She was so well sailed and she was so good at fighting that orders were only a minimum of 2 British frigates engage her. Constitution finds herself coming out of Boston, and way offshore, the billowing sails of the HMS Tendos and the HMS Endymion, both frigates, see Constitution. Constitution's in very light air. There were times that Constitution, in a 4-day chase, outran 7 British frigates. She was in the lead, and all the frigates are behind. It was 2 days into the chase that they realized that Constitution was being rotowed by her crew and the Nantucket whaleboats. Wow. So they shipped their boats over and started towing their own vessels. This is the same thing that the British fleet was doing with English convoy. They're escorting British merchant ships across the Atlantic. And what they would do is they would take the bigger naval ships, they'd go all the way to the back of the line, they'd sail tow all the slow merchant ships forward, drop them off, sail back and grab the small ones. Meanwhile, the privateers are picking at them like the lions at the antelope. England was also fighting Napoleon. So they're running short on assets in spite of having 750 commissioned naval ships. Constitution's coming up. Tendos and Endymion are now going to engage her. But Constitution has the advantage of 2 pilots on board that were Marblehead pilots. These pilots took right over here in these very convoluted waters off of there, and they piloted her into Marblehead Harbor underneath the safety of Fort Sewell with her long guns. There was no ship that would engage anyone that had long guns. You just had to be out of range, you were fine. But Tendos and Endymion, recognizing Fort Sewell was there, they bared away and Constitution sailed for another day. Constitution knew which battles to run from and which ones to engage. She was very well sailed and she was very well fought. 6 months later, we find the same HMS Endymion has now come off her blockade post in New York Harbor. Endymion is going to Halifax to reprovision. She has got 550 men aboard. The Princeton Neuchtel is the #1 privateer that they want to get off the high seas. The Châtel alone is responsible for taking $4.5 million of British commerce off of the high seas, and she is #1. Princeton Neuchtel has come up south of the Vineyard, south of Nantucket, and she's inside the dangerous Nantucket shoals. She's a privateer like this, so she doesn't draw the 18 feet of depth that the others do, that a British frigate would. Julius Ordino is the captain of the privateer, and he's a fierce, fierce fighter. He stands about this tall, and his stature does not regard him to be honored by a command. But he's an incredibly good sailor. He's a very fierce fighter, and he has told his men he will never be taken alive by the British because he will be a dead man. The crew know that Ordino is serious about this. Ordino never used a swear word running his crew. Ordino could outwork his mates and his chief and second mate. Ordino, nicknamed the Sea Wolf, was a real fierce fighter. Stands the men down, everybody hydrates, they eat. Stands the men down, and all of a sudden at 8 o'clock at night, he hears the sound of a grapple. Ordino knows the men are here, the British are here, and pay attention. I'm not going to read the whole book, but I will. On October 11th, 1814, the hardest fought naval engagement of the entire war took place off of Nantucket between the privateer Princeton Neuchtel and 5 barges from the British frigate Endymion. When the British boarders succeeded in gaining the forecastle of the privateer, her captain swept them overboard with a hail of canister shot and bags of musket balls fired across the main deck from one of her main guns. Again, the British regulars suffered a loss of 100 or more to the American privateers, 9 killed and 19 wounded. You're telling me that the hardest fought naval engagement in the entire war happened on Nantucket and 105 British were killed? It's the hardest fought naval engagement because so many men were killed. The British lost 105 Royal Marine trained fighters to 36 merchant sailors. Ordino, after they gain the forecastle, he takes a swivel, spins it around and fires across there, blows them away. He kills 15 of them right then with grape shot. Ordino needs more information. So there's this guy down in the Chesapeake Bay, and he's standing there at the Battle of Fort McHenry, and he's peering through a gun port. This guy's name is Francis Scott Key, and Francis Scott Key is in the Chesapeake on the commanding British vessel's ship for one reason. He's there to negotiate the release of a doctor. Now, Nantucket's own Abaya Folger was born on Nantucket. Her son is doing the same thing, but he's doing it over in France, trying to negotiate the release, man for British sailor. See, when Madison declared war, he was declaring war against England for 3 reasons. British sailor impressment of American sailors, dual taxation without representation, and there was no free trade in sailors' rights. We know the dual taxation without representation because we all know what the Boston Tea Party was, right? You pay for your tea in England, your duty there, you bring it to America, and they want duty again, dual taxation. Oh, by the way, both of those ships in the Boston Tea Party were Nantucket ships. This lady, Abaya Folger from Nantucket, her son that's doing the negotiations, his name is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is unsuccessful in obtaining any release of American sailors. Francis Scott Key, in his famous poem that turned into our national anthem, has a thing that says, "And the rocket's red glare and the bombs burst in air." Well, the rocket's red glare and the bombs burst in air are what we call fireworks. They didn't blow anything up, they didn't burn anything, they didn't do anything. They create light, smoke, and intimidate. Well, Ordino, after they gain the forecastle, he sends up a rocket because he needs to know, what am I up against? So the rocket goes off, gives him the illumination he needs, and he is stunned. Ordno has now got 5 British barges with 25 men apiece on the barge. There are 150 trained Royal Marine fighters tied alongside his privateer, and they're ready to go. He's got 38 prisoners down below. He's got 36 men on deck. Ordno sees that he's so outnumbered that his men are in retreat. Ordno knows if he's taken, he's a dead man. So Ordno takes a lit torch, stands over the powder magazine, and says, if you don't fight to the death, I will blow the ship up now. His men now become more afraid of him than they are of 150 Royal Marine fighters that are tied alongside, and the fight breaks out. A big half-an-hour battle. At the end of the battle, well, before the end of the battle, the second in command, now you have to know, on a ship that's got 550 Royal Marine fighters on it, the 150 they sent over were pretty good, including the commanders. The number one in command has been killed. Second in command calls quarter. That's like calling uncle. When you call quarter, you do not take up arms again. He called quarter and he said, we need to see your surgeon. Bring us up on deck. Ordno looks around. I got 9 guys. He thinks on his feet, quickly tells the second in command, you can't come up on deck, our surgeon was killed. Ordno said, we're sending buckets down, put all your weapons in the buckets, we'll send the buckets back down with food and water, you'll receive medical care and repatriation and pardon from the good people of Nantucket tomorrow, but you're gonna stand down. Ordno has now got 9 guys that have survived out of the 36 that aren't wounded. 9 healthy guys. 105 British are dead. The Ordno allows the other men off the ship, and in the morning the Nantucketers come out and they cannot believe what they see. They see dead British on the beach. They see barges drifting away with dead men on them. So you have to know that this is significant in the fact that 36 merchant mariners have engaged the Royal Navy and have killed 105. England is suffering terribly because Lloyd's of London is insuring all the cargoes, and none of the cargoes are making it into America because the American privateers are so successful. So the money is not making it to the crown. They just killed 150 men, 105 men. The money's not coming in. They can no longer afford to be escorting these ships across the Atlantic. So eventually, England capitulates in the War of 1812. And the result of this is that people that will tell you that the War of 1812 was a lost war, that nobody won it. Never again did they impress American sailors into the Royal Navy. We got rid of dual taxation without representation, and we got free trade and sailors' rights. So after the war, these boats really turned into just revenue boats, the revenue service. They went so fast you couldn't regulate them. So they made it illegal to own these boats, and they turned it into the original Coast Guard Revenue Service. But we ushered in, because of free trade and sailors' rights, we ushered in the glory days of the big 300-foot schooners, the Great Republics, the Flying Clouds, the Red Jackets. Captain Donald Marque, who designed the best clippers of the world, was right from here. He was from Hamilton and Newbury, and then built the Flying Cloud in East Boston. But that's what the War of 1812 ushered in. It was these boats that were responsible. It's these boats that the Star-Spangled Banner is written all about, because it was the British were at Fort McHenry after burning Washington down to burn down the shipyards in Baltimore that were building these boats. They wanted to take them out at the source. So as a result of the War of 1812, we finally got our independence. And that's what the story is. That's what Lynx is. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your sail.
Cool. I'm here with Richard from Stowe, and he's spent the summer on the Lynx. So how do you like it?
Oh, it's great. You're out there and you're doing something different. I'm actually working and experiencing different places.
So do you have a specific job on the ship, or?
I'm gunner, coxswain, and deckhand.
So what's that mean?
Gunner and coxswain means that, or the gunner means that I deal with the guns. Coxswain means that the small boat is under my control, and deckhand just means that I'm a basic person that goes around and pulls on lines and makes sure everything works.
So what do you like best about being on the ship?
Probably voyaging, so going multiple days from one place to another, typically hundreds of miles. The best one I did was last year. It took a week to get from St. Pete, South Carolina to Nantucket.
Is that the longest you've ever been offshore?
Yep, 100 miles offshore.
So I'm here with
Captain Alex Peacock of the Lynx.
what does it mean? What do you do as captain?
Oh, well, I command the whole vessel, so I tell the chief mate what we're going to do, and he runs the deck, and I take all the responsibility if it goes wrong.
So do you ever help with the stuff the rest of the crew does, or?
For the most part, I try to stay hands-on as possible, but I'm always planning and looking at the big picture stuff while the crew maintains and make sure the ship's ready to operate.
How long have you been the captain?
About 3 years now, full-time of Lynx, yep.
How'd you get into it?
That's a long story. I started out sailing as a child. My father was a captain, and after high school, I got on a boat in Maine and kind of fell in love with the technology of the traditional rigs, and it kind of just took on from there. I wasn't shanghaied like a lot of other people.
Okay. What do you like about being a captain and everything?
Well, I like leading a team and watching that team learn to work together and get very proficient and efficient at running the operations and evolutions of the ship. Watching the whole working machine come together. It's quite rewarding. And also the students we take on board, watching that progress happen.
When's the longest you've ever been sailing from one point to another?
About 17 days. Yeah.
Where were you going?
That was on the West Coast, from California headed to Panama, and Panama up the East Coast of the United States.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so I'm here with Catherine from the Bluenose, which is another ship that has come for Schooner Fest this weekend. So where is this boat from?
We're from Nova Scotia, Canada, Lunenburg specifically.
So you came all the way over here?
Yep, we sailed to Boston, and then the other day we sailed over from Boston to Gloucester.
So how long have you been on the ship?
This is my second season on board. So I did 6 months last year and then started again in April this year.
How'd you start or get into this?
Really just apply like any other job. I did sail a little bit when I was a kid, and then I was on a couple other tall ships before this. But this is my first real experience with a tall ship and a schooner especially.
Did you grow up in Nova Scotia?
I did, yeah.
What area?
Yarmouth, so it's the southwestern tip of the province.
Did you know you wanted, did you think you wanted to sail when you got older or anything?
No, actually. My training is in journalism, actually. So I was working in the industry in communications in a boring office job. And I was on my lunch break one day and I saw the Bluenose sailing by in the Halifax Harbor. And I just thought, I wonder what they do for crew. And then I looked it up, and then here I am, 2 years later.
So what do you do as crew on the ship?
Anything and everything as a deckhand. So we're responsible for cleaning the ship. Every morning we do a deck wash. We do all of the maintenance. We help raise and lower the sails. We steer the ship. Pretty much, yeah, everything.
What's the farthest you ever been or longest you ever been sailing at once without stopping?
So last year we sailed up to Quebec City from Halifax. And that was about six days of transit.
What's the farthest you've ever been offshore?
Offshore. That's a good question. Probably sailing from Lunenburg to Boston. I'm not sure exactly what the mileage would be offshore, but you can't see land for a while and you lose cell phone service, so it's got to be pretty far.
Do you do tours on the ship, or?
We do, yeah. We do day sails out of Lunenburg and in Halifax, so we'll go out with passengers just for a 2-hour sail.
And do you race a lot?
We actually don't race this one. It was part of the stipulation with the original Bluenose.
Mm-hmm.
So the original Bluenose was undefeated in the races, so when they built the replica, one of the requirements was that they weren't allowed to race.
So you won't be racing tomorrow?
We won't be racing, but apparently we are sailing tomorrow with the boats that are racing.
You'll be sailing around with them?
Yeah.
So where is the race out to?
Tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, actually. Yeah.
Long way out.
Yeah.
Close enough. So do you want to race, or is it just not something that you've ever
I wish that we raced.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be a lot of fun, but yeah, we're not allowed to, unfortunately. We did sail with Columbia yesterday from Boston, which was really cool, because the original Bluenose raced the original Columbia, so it was pretty historic to be part of that with the two boats sailing together.
Are there any other boat, tall ships where you're from that you could race with, or?
No, actually, we are the only large schooner in Nova Scotia and in Canada, really. So it's nice to see some other big ones around here.
Okay, well, thank you.
Anytime, no problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I am here in the Columbia with
Shannon Wolfe.
And how long have you been on the ship?
Close to 4 months.
Is this your first year on the ship, or?
Yep, so 4 months.
Okay, so where's the ship from, Columbia?
She's out of Panama City, Florida. It's in the Gulf Coast of Florida on the Panhandle. And that's where she was built and where her home port is now. So we're docked next to the Bluenose, and this is actually a really historic weekend in that we have the Bluenose and the Columbia right next to each other and also sailing together. And both of these boats are the second incarnation, and so the original Bluenose and Columbia were both built early 1920s, and they were fishing schooners, but they were actually built to race. So they were technically fishing schooners, but the real purpose they were both built was to race each other even. Bluenose was representing Nova Scotia, and Columbia was representing Gloucester, the original. And they both sunk within, Columbia sunk within 10 years. I'm not sure about Bluenose. But then these two boats were rebuilt within the last century. Columbia's more modern. Bluenose was built in the 60s, I believe. And this is the first time the Bluenose 2 and second Columbia have sailed together. So it's really exciting, it's really historic. There's a little bit of history about the original Columbia. So our current Columbia was built to model the original Columbia. She's got the same rig and the exact same hull dimensions, deck dimensions. The deck itself is a little bit different in that we have hydraulic winches to help us out, and everything below decks is modern. But the rig is completely the same.
So is this the first time you've raced in the Columbia?
We've been racing this whole month. It's been a really exciting month. Every weekend we've been doing a different race up in New England. We raced yesterday and won, but there was also no one else in our class. The Bluenose isn't allowed to race, otherwise that would have been really fun. But we outsailed everyone yesterday, I'm going to say it that way.
So where was your first race?
My first race would have been just down the coast in Marblehead about a month ago. Yeah, this is the first I've gotten into racing. It's exciting.
Did you grow up around the water?
I grew up in New Mexico, which is not at all around the water. But my parents kept a sailboat down in the Sea of Cortez, which is west coast Mexico. And so we would go down there because they missed the water. So we would go down there for vacations and cruise. And actually, when I was 12, I spent a year living on the boat, which was awesome. And then just through the course of that was kind of my start in the world of sailing. And through the course of that, I ended up getting hired on tall ships about a year ago. Actually, a year ago yesterday is when I started working on boats.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, it was really good talking with you. Thanks, Gloucester.
Okay, I'm on the Lannon here, right out of Gloucester. So what's your name again?
My name is Captain Tom Ellis.
Okay, so as captain, what do you have to do on the Lannon?
I have to be responsible, first of all, for the safety of the passengers and the ship. And beyond that, I have to be hospitable to people and make them feel like they're a little special and that this is an important time for them to learn about what it might have been like to be on a sailing vessel out of this town 100 years ago.
And how long have you been captain?
Oh, for about 20 years.
Were you the first captain, or was there someone else before you?
Yeah, Captain Steele was the first captain of the Lannon, and after I had enough hours on a boat this size, then I could get my 100-ton license, and so then I had my 100-ton license, and now my son owns the boat, and he's the captain. I run it for him a couple of days a week now.
Do you know anything about the history of the Lannon, or?
I know a lot about the history of the Lannon. Do you know anything about the history of this town?
Not really.
No, but you're learning, right?
Yeah, sort of.
Is it interesting to you?
What I've learned so far.
History isn't really that interesting to young people, is it?
Not really.
Do you like hang around and talk about history to kids?
No.
No, well, you know what history is good for? History is good for giving you a perspective on the past so that you can see a clear path to your future. So to know and learn from the people that came before you is an important thing. And the history of Gloucester and Essex is a history rich in a people who strive to make better and safer boats so that they could go out in the ocean and come back and provide for their families. So our history is a history of people working together and not a history of wars, which most histories seem to be about, right? And that's probably why kids don't like learning about history, is because they would much rather learn about things that are a little more pleasant than wars. And so the history of these vessels and the men and now women that sail on them is a rich, rich part of American history, and we wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War to fight our independence if it wasn't for the people on the oceans interrupting the British supply lines. And so we have a lot of great history behind these boats. This particular boat was designed in 1903 by a man named Mal McLean. He was the captain of 35 brand new vessels in 50 years. Imagine almost every year he had a brand new boat. And there were over 100 boats built from his designs. And I had an idea that I could take people out and show them a little bit about this history. So I went to Essex, where these boats were built, and I got Harold Burnham, who was 29 years old at the time, and his family have been building boats right in the same spot since 1643 for 11 generations. And so we decided on this design. It represents the end of all working sailboats in this part of the country. So it was designed by a Gloucester guy for fishing out of this town, by the people in this town, and all the wood came from within 10 miles of here. We spent 2 months cutting trees, and we'd go in the woods in the morning and we'd hear, you know how trees scrape together and they kind of make squeaky noises? Well, it almost sounded like they were saying, "I want to be a schooner." And so we'd go, yeah, where do you live?
Stowe.
Stowe.
This is going to be on Stowe TV, so.
Oh, cool. Maybe they'll all come from Stowe and come out here for a sail on the Thomas Lannon. Our website is www.schooner.org. And they can go online and buy tickets and come out here. And if they don't have a good time on this boat, we'll give them their money back. How's that? Yeah.
Sounds like a deal.
So anyway, this Schooner Festival brings back memories of the days when these fishing boats used to go out and did you see the parade of sail yesterday?
Yeah.
And all the boats. This town was built on the mackerel fishing, and the mackerel fishing was hard for a small family to get into because they needed a big seine boat and they needed big nets, and so it was mostly company boats that did this. And they would be spending 2 or 3 weeks after winter halibutting out there on the Georges banks. They would come in and get their boats ready to go on mackerel fishing, and they'd all be in here, and then somebody would say, "Hey, the mackerel down off Rhode Island," and everybody would jump in their boats and take off, and it would be a race out there. And so that's what started these guys racing. If they could get to the fish before everybody else, they made the money, right? And then in 1920, the fishermen up in Halifax were sitting around talking, and the America's Cup race was canceled for 23 knots of wind. And the fishermen up there in Canada said we wouldn't have gone out if it wasn't blowing 20. And so they said, let's challenge the Gloucester boys to a real sailing match, a fisherman's race. And so we went up there with the LC in 1920 and we beat them. And then they built a boat that's a replica of the Bluenose there from Canada. And that's part of Canadian maritime pride. They have a picture of that boat on their dime up there. It means a lot to the Canadians, and they seem to be more in tune with their maritime history than we are in this country, but we're working on it. So then each year we went up there to try to beat that boat, and we never could beat them 4 out of 7. But this old timer told me, and he raced on the T-bolt against that boat, he said, why, the only time those Canadians ever beat a Gloucesterman was in a drifting contest with no wind. But that's just all having fun. Angus Walters, who was the captain of the Bluenose, used to say, when we're racing, there's no friends. But when we're done racing, we're just as good friends as we ever was. So anyway, the one next to it is the Columbia, and that was built to race the Bluenose. And to see those two boats together has been a fantastic thing that no one has seen since 1938. And this morning I was over there talking to the captains, and this old fella started walking down the pier, and he looked a little rickety, so I gave him my arm, and we were talking on the way out. And when he was a boy, he went on the Columbia and went and bought the guys tobacco and cigarettes, and he was only 6 years old. He said, can you imagine a 6-year-old going into a store and buying cigarettes and tobacco? You couldn't do that today, right?
Okay, well, you have a bunch of passengers that want to board, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm here with
Carolyn Corbin
from the adventure. So how long have you been on the adventure?
I started in April. There was 3 of us that started on April 2nd, and we've been here thus far.
Is this the first tall ship you've worked on, or?
No, I've been in tall ships for about 5 years now. I'm a mate on Adventure, so it's my first time being a chief mate, but it's not my first schooner, but it's a good one.
What was your first schooner?
My first schooner was... I don't actually know what my first schooner was. My first tall ship was the Maryland Dove down in St. Mary's, Maryland, where I'm from. But my first schooner I was ever on might have been Pride of Baltimore too.
So the adventure's from Gloucester. Are you from the area, or?
No, I grew up in Maryland, and I came up here last year to work on the Roseway, actually, doing some repair work. And then I was in Maine last year, and I heard about this job, so that's kind of how I got here.
What can you tell me about the adventure?
Yeah, Adventure's Gloucester's home fishing schooner. She was built up in Essex in 1926 at the same shipyard that actually built the Roseway 1 year earlier. So Roseway and Adventure have had a long history together. Adventure was able to come back to her home port 30 years ago in 1988 after serving as a windjammer up in Camden, Maine. So it's been a really, really great time to have her back. We've been really happy to be part of the story that has brought her back to Gloucester and turned her back into what she looked like when she was a fishing schooner in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so to have her here with Roseway, as also the rebuild of Columbia and Bluenose too, was really special this weekend because we had 4 fishing schooners from pretty much the same time period in history who the captains would all have known each other historically, and we all got to see each other this year and sail together. It was a really special moment.
So how'd you do during the race yesterday?
We did really well. We took first in our class. I don't know what our overall time was. We had a very close finish with Lynx. Actually, it was very cool. We kind of crossed the line together. We're not in the same class, but it was a really fun end to the race, being able to sail with them.
So what boats were in your class?
We were with the Roseway and then the Liberty Clipper, who was also from Boston.
When did you get into working on tall ships?
Yeah, I started when I was a senior in high school, transitioning to a freshman in college. I spent all the summers in my college years, I guess, working in St. Mary's County, Maryland, on the Maryland Dove as a shipwright's apprentice and docent, also volunteer sailor. And then my junior year of college, my captain kicked me off and told me to go sailing. So I went and did a program with SEA, where I sailed from Massachusetts to Ireland, and then I worked on the brig Niagara the same summer. So when I graduated college the next year, I actually had a job on a schooner waiting for me. And then since then, it was just easier to stay in tall ships and keep progressing up than trying to find a job in the field that I graduated with in college. It's harder and harder to get a job in the profession of archaeology without doing internships. But I've been really happy with tall ships and having different avenues, but I'd really like to, I think, step away from being a mate and go back to being more of a bosun or a shipwright carpenter. It's kind of the goal right now.
So as mate, what do you have to do on the ship?
A lot. I'm kind of the executive branch, so to speak. The captain is the legislative branch. He makes all the decisions, and then I make sure that they're carried out. The captain and I work really closely to make the best plan for the ship for the day, looking at the wind, the weather, the passengers. And then I also make sure that the ship is always clean and taken care of and ready. I write a lot of maintenance plans. I ensure that we get gas. Just kind of having the overall bird's eye view of what's happening on the vessel and making sure that the crew is able to carry out what they need to do, as well as get some time for themselves. Just make sure the ship and all of her parts, the crew included, move forward instead of stagnating. And I've got some really great support. The crew this year is wonderful. I have a wonderful second mate. I have an amazing education coordinator. All of the deckhands are really wonderful. We have a really lucky crew this year, and it makes my job a lot easier.
How many people do you have on the crew this year?
We had 11 up until this weekend, and now we have 10. The captain, myself, a second mate, an assistant engineer, an education coordinator, bosun, a cook, and then the rest of them are deckhands, including one volunteer deckhand who's been with the ship through, I guess, 2 organizations since the 90s. So he's a really amazing continuance of tradition that we've had, and we're really lucky to have Phil aboard this year.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.